experimenting with sound generators in the school science lab, combined with the writing of composer John Cage, inspired a young Nigel Jacklin in his interest to explore improvisation and electronics. The emerging DIY cassette scene of 1979 was the perfect channel for the abstract live recordings of the collective of underground performers that he gathered around him. No words, no titles, no meaning. This is the world of alien brains. This is cassette culture.
I felt that playing songs with conventional structures was too restrictive. Everything was spontaneous and improvised. I would record these improvisations, then listen and select excerpts which appealed to me. We were who we were. There was no hype, there was no pretense. No matter how awkward or awful it was, our attitude was always, fuck you. Brains only really came into being in 1979. The DIY cassette scene was just starting, and bands like the Instant Automatons encouraged others to follow their example of it was easy, it was cheap, go and do it ethos. I'd received tapes in the mail from Mark Lancaster of Instant Automatons, Alan Adams of Methods of Execution, Richard Rupenus of Funeral Dance Party, and a few others.
A lot of the stuff that we were distributed ourselves was sort of friends of ours kind of thing. So Nigel Jacklin of Alien Brains was a friend of ours. So we released the first Alien Brains cassette, Menial Disorders. I played with him on one particular gig. Yes, that was when Nigel was still at school. He went to Oundle, which is a public school in Cambridgeshire, and he'd arranged to do this sort of gig, just basically him, a couple of his friends, and he invited me to come along. So I went down there and I just sort of played guitar and we recorded it. That recording is what forms the basis of the Menial Disorders cassette.
I organised Alien Brains' first concert to take place in the school's chemistry lecture theatre. Well, Mark Lancaster came down and there were also some school friends involved. Mark brought a guitar, drum machine and echo unit. The performance lasted 2 hours. At the beginning there were 35 people in the audience, and at the end there were 8. They use various sound generators, Loopatron, Revox, reel-to-reel recorder and tape splicer for editing. All equipment was either borrowed or belonged to those who participated on the day. There was a ready supply of sound generators in the school's physics department, and there was also a Revox reel-to-reel tape machine, which was considered to be very state-of-the-art at the time. The Loopatron belonged to Bobby, who was a member of the pub rock-cum-punk band Riff Raff. It was a loop tape echo machine with a control on the erase head. Normally the sound was erased at the end of each loop. However, the Loopatron enabled you to turn the volume down on the erase head, so the sounds on the loop would gradually build up. I'd asked Mark if he'd like to release Menial Disorders on deleted records, and to my surprise and delight, he said yes. The Menial Disorders master I gave to Mark was the original reel-to-reel tape, which he then used to dub the cassettes in real time.
In his final year at Oundle School, Nigel was about to set in motion an event that soon became seen as a shocking meeting of worlds. He'd invited the group of artists who were already labelled the wreckers of civilization into the very heart of the British public school system.
Would you like to play a gig at Oundle School on March the 16th, which is a Sunday? Unfortunately, it will be fairly restricted to more or less just schoolboys, although I know Alan Adams and that lot, they can come along, and yeah, people who I know who are into Throbbing Gristle. I can pay you a certain amount, probably about £180 if you bring your PA. You've got a PA, haven't you? I think Alan Adams is going to ring you up.
As head of the school's Rock Sock, that's the Rock Music Society, each term I organised a concert in the school's main hall. I had been corresponding with Throbbing Gristle for a while, so I invited them to perform in the school's main hall. They agreed and said they could bring Monty Kazaza as the support act. I explained to the teacher in charge that Throbbing Gristle were an avant-garde group who had things in common with John Cage.
To all the absent mothers of the young boys here tonight. I'm sure if they were here watching you tonight, they'd wonder whether it was worth all the money.
In terms of the actual performance, Monty loved it as some of the boys tried to boo him off. TG got a very mixed reception, which they enjoyed.
Well, one of the boys asked us if we'd go and play, because his music teacher said that I think they were allowed to invite a band. Sleazy being from public school and everything else, he fancied a revisit. So, and everything that represented to him. So we said, yeah, it'd be great. We'll come along as long as we can have lunch with the boys in the refectory. And it was really like, you know, John Brown school days. It was very bizarre. And we had a tour of the school before the gig and everything. And then we performed in the evening, and I remember they had a gallery at the end opposite the stage, and the teachers were all lined up, and they were in shock. And all the boys were down the bottom, weren't they? And they were going absolutely crazy. I mean, they got to the point where they didn't know how to react to it in the end. Monty did a gig as well, and he
didn't go down very.
He didn't go down very well, and he did the worst thing possible when they threw things at him. He threw them back, so it ended up in a, you know, saying, "No, you don't do that." You know, so then we went on after him and sort of calmed them down by battering them, basically.
Yeah.
I think. But they loved it. They went absolutely mad.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got that raw material there, haven't you?
Yeah.
I doubt any of them would forget about it.
A small minority of the pupils were very angry with me for having organised the concert and kept haranguing me. Others have said it was a transformative experience. Both performances were filmed by Stan Bingo, aka Daniel Landin, who I met again later when he was a member of Last Few Days. Daniel also did some filming in and around the school, which was also included on the Live at Oundle School video. Monty's performance was included on a live cassette also released by Industrial Records.
You heard Chris and Cosey recalling this performance in an interview with Luke Turner of The Quietus in 2010. After the gig, Nigel and Richard Rupenus visited Genesis and TG at their Martello Street studio in London while planning the next steps for Alien Brains. Here's how Richard describes his discovery of the cassette network and his first encounters with Nigel.
My introduction to deleted records was when I responded to a small advert that Mark Lancaster of Instant Automatons had placed in the regular DIY corner cassette column in Sound's music paper. This would have been in January 1980. The first deleted release I obtained was Alien Brains' Menial Disorders. Through Mark, I contacted Nigel and subsequently became a member of Alien Brains. Like all Alien Brains live performances, the one at the Basement in Newcastle on Valentine's Day 1982 was a very strange affair. The Basement was a performance art venue. Many of the leading names in the field of performance art had appeared there. The venue, which despite its name wasn't actually a basement, was next door to the Spectro Arts Workshop, which was primarily a free improvisation venue, which had hosted many of the leading names in the field of free improv, including AMM, Derek Bailey, Lol Coxall, Evan Parker, and many others. In the mid-1980s, my group, Funeral Dance Party, performed at Spectro as part of an experimental and electronic music festival, and had succeeded in driving every single member of the audience out of the venue. One of the organisers was pinned up against a wall by a disgruntled audience member who demanded that his entrance fee be reimbursed. We managed to escape via a back door. I performed with Alien Brains at the Arts Centre in Aberdeen in the previous year, and that was a resounding success. So after that, Nigel suggested that Alien Brains perform in Newcastle, and I thought the Basement would be an ideal venue. As with all Alien Brains performances, everything was 99% spontaneous. Very little had been discussed or planned beforehand, apart from Nigel's suggestion that we place various pungent-smelling items in the venue's heating system several hours prior to the audience arriving. We'd obtained some fish heads the day before, but unfortunately they'd become extremely rancid, so we decided to dispose of them. The array of both pleasing and evil-smelling aromas was basically just an attempt to add something extra to the overall experience. When I met Neil Purvis, who travelled up from London with Nigel, I discovered that he was currently reading R.D. Laing's book Knots, which was a favourite of mine. Totally unplanned, towards the end of the performance, Neil started reading random passages from Knots, which I thought was a nice touch. As with all Alien Brains performances, we considered this one to have been both something of a success and a failure. But in Alien Brains' world, failure was sometimes more interesting than success.
I'd met Neil at some gigs in London fairly soon after I moved down there. I'm not sure whether he had any musical ability, but that wasn't important, as I was, and still am, an advocate of John Cage's view that non-musicians were as relevant as trained musicians as they aren't tainted with the traditional constraints of musicianship. Neil is originally from near Newcastle, so it seemed appropriate to invite him along. We had a different random person who was also a non-musician at the Aberdeen Arts Centre concert, so perhaps that set a precedent. I'd done quite a bit with Richard and Philip by that stage, including recordings in a disused World War II water tower and on an out-of-tune old piano in an old Women's Institute hut. Just prior to the performance in Newcastle would have been the first time Neil had met Richard and Philip. We just turned up and played. It was improvised, nothing was planned, except for the instruments and equipment we took with us, which consisted of a melodica, a drum machine, and assorted junk we found lying around. It wasn't about the audience. Richard remembers a couple of people, including John Smith, who produced Interchange, an experimental music magazine, and some local art students. We really didn't care if there was an audience or not. This performance was issued on cassette as Live at the Basement by US label Eon.
Nigel had moved to a flat in West London and began connecting with like-minded people. One of these was Philip Sanderson of Stormbugs, who he met just in time to contribute a track to the Snatch 3 compilation and recruit him into the Alien Brains collective.
By then, Garage Land and DIY Corner had got going. So the address, Westbourne Terrace at Muslim Hampton, had been published a few times, and people would just drop by then, of course, because there was no internet, and I'm not even sure we had a phone. So people would just, you'd always invite them in. I don't think I ever turned anyone away. It ended up recording. I remember when Nigel turned up, it was late summer. Two or 3 years afterwards, there was a gig, which was myself, David Chapman, Nigel Jacklin, and the Rupenus brothers. We did this gig, and my memory of it is a handful of people. It's in this old school building. We would do the odd thing whereby, just with whatever was there, gas pipes, just I guess we didn't call it this, but it was a kind of form of improvisation, not dissimilar to kind of things that the Blockaders did on some of their seminal recordings. Dragging the table across the floor to get those kind of squeaky, screechy sounds that we know and love. Yes.
That same year, 1982, we also performed at the Centro Iberico, an old abandoned Victorian school on the Harrow Road in London, where Throbbing, Gristle and Whitehouse had previously played. The building was squatted by some Spanish anarchists, and it was near where I lived, so I just went in one day and asked if we could play there. This was among our most sparsely attended performance, due to the fact that there had hardly been any advertising whatsoever, apart from a small mention in the London-based entertainment magazine Time Out. Stephen Stapleton and John Fothergill of Nurse with Wound were among the few who attended. Steve was rather curious about the walkie-talkie system we'd set up as part of a cobbled-together PA. An excerpt from this performance was included on the British Interiors cassette.
Young artists from across Europe had been exchanging cassettes through the network and exploring the cultures in their neighbouring countries. Hanging out in your local record store on the weekends was still a tradition, and if you were in West London, there was no better record store than Rough Trade.
I'd met Joep van Brakel in the Rough Trade record shop in London, and he introduced me to Harold Schellings of the Young Lions. A New Year's Eve concert with Truus de Groot, Nasmac and Harold Schellings, the Young Lions, at Ultras in Amsterdam was the biggest event we ever played. I also visited and worked with Nigel Jacklin from Toes Productions in Niort and Paris, and Alien Brains contributed to several compilations which Lionel issued on his Toes production label. Later on, I worked with Dominic Guerin, SPK, Twin Vision, and hung around with a couple of members of Last Few Days who were very interesting until they got a record contract.
The spirit of community among underground artists in London was well established by now, and friendly networking was common. It wasn't long before Nigel encountered one of the original DIY bands of the post-punk era, The Door and the Window. We tracked down Bendle, co-founder of the group.
I never made contact with him until after the first incarnation of The Door and the Window had split up. But in those days, I would go out, often go out with friends, but if I wanted to go out to a gig, I always knew that there would be people in the audience that I would know, and meeting people, or people will always introduce me to somebody else, saying, "Oh, have you met him? You ought to meet this person. He's doing this sort of horrible noise that you're doing too." So we always referred to, I never called him Nigel. We always called him Alien, or Alien Brains. We said, "So where you go?" "I'm going round Aliens." Never called him Nigel. But then everybody I knew had sort of slightly odd names. So he would come round, and we had a room that we just used as what we called a rehearsal room in our house. We would make a lot of noise and annoy the neighbours. So he came round there, and I would visit him a lot at his house. And we'd kind of do very understated experiments. What I think I always remember about one place he lived in Lancaster Gate, which was sort of near Notting Hill, near lots of interesting areas in London. And he'd got a flat that he shared with two Italian women. in this fact, he had a very nice, very expensive hi-fi system. And he'd plug a microphone into it, expensive microphone, and we'd hang it out the window into the street and just record bits of conversations of people. I'd got the first recording Walkman that Sony put out, which is a great thing with sort of very speed on it and independent recording levels from left and right, and it was great. So I was already, you walk around with headphones on, people think you're listening to music, but actually you're recording them walking down the street. So me and Nigel kind of coincided in this sort of listening in on other people and just trying to put random bits of information together and put it into a kind of collage of music stuff. Because he had this kind of collage instinct, as I understood it, he'd probably just take bits that he'd recorded here and there and throw them in together with the other bits.
Alien Brain's final release was as Verdenskang, a cassette entitled And It's There, issued by the Italian label ADN. The final performance was also in London at the Architectural Association. By this time, the mid-80s, it really felt like I was just going through the motions. A mess of equipment, wires and confusion, playing as part of someone's final year degree show. I took a taxi home, and as far as I was concerned, that was the end of Alien Brains.
In this episode of the Cassette Culture Podcast, you heard from me, Martin Franklin, and Mark Lancaster of Instant Automatons and Deleted Records, Philip Sanderson of the Stormbugs and Snatch Tapes, and Bendle from The Door and the Window. The words of Nigel Jacklin were read by Robert Hayes, and Richard Rupenus read by Tim Nice. Cosey, Fanni, Tutti and Chris Carter were recorded at the Rough Trade East in conversation with Luke Turner of the Quietus. The music you heard was Alien Brains from Blatantly Nihilist on Fashionable Trousers, Menial Disorders on Deleted Records. The Answer Machine message by Nigel Jacklin, titled The Preparation for the Corruption of Oundle Public School on 23 Drifts to Guestling, released by Iron Productions. Throbbing Gristle from Throbbing Gristle at Oundle School, released on VHS tape by Industrial Records. Alien Brains live at the basement on VLZ Productions. Song 4 by Nigel Jacklin from Snatch 3, released on Snatch Tapes. Alien Brains from British Interiors, their self-released cassette. And The Blaunk Tepes, also self-released. And It's There by Verdenskang, released on ADN Tapes.